It became their pattern. Each day, Clara rose early, still compelled to work, and each evening, Samuel insisted she sit at his table. Slowly, the walls between them softened. She found herself humming as she swept the porch, something she hadn't done since her teaching days. He began to speak more, sharing stories of the ranch, of the cattle drives, of the land he had inherited from his father. One night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Clara finally asked the question that had burned inside her since that first evening. Why me? Why open your door to me, when you could have turned me away like everyone else? Samuel set down his fork, his gaze drifting toward the fire. His voice was quiet when he answered. Years ago, after my wife passed, I nearly lost the ranch. I nearly lost myself. One neighbor, just one, came by and said, "Stay on your feet, Samuel. You still got work to do. Don't let grief bury you." He gave me food, helped mend fences, didn't ask for a thing. That little bit of kindness was the rope that pulled me back from the edge. And I swore if I ever had enough to give, I'd do the same for someone else. Clara's throat closed. She had expected many answers: loneliness, duty, pity, but not this. Not a man who gave because he remembered what it felt like to need. "You're not a debt, Clara," he said softly. "You're a person, and this house is better with you in it." Her tears came before she could stop them. She turned her face away, ashamed of her weakness, but Samuel didn't move closer or touch her. He only let her weep in peace, as though he understood that sometimes the greatest gift isn't fixing a wound, it's letting it breathe. From that night, Clara's heart began to shift. She no longer thought of herself as a trespasser in Samuel's home. She began to wonder, quietly, if perhaps she belonged here, not as payment, but as presence. The ranch began to change, too. The silence that had weighed on the halls lightened. Clara planted flowers near the porch, their colors bright against the wood. Samuel, who had once eaten alone, began setting 2 cups of coffee out every morning without fail. Laughter, faint at first, returned to the house. And yet, inside Clara, doubt still lived. She had come to the door offering herself as trade. Even if Samuel hadn't taken her up on it, that shame lingered, like a shadow she couldn't shake. But little by little, Samuel's steady kindness chipped at it. Not grand gestures, not sweeping declarations, just the daily rhythm of respect, of space, of dignity. The deal Clara had expected was never spoken. Instead, something else took its place, an unspoken agreement of hearts. He would give her shelter, and she would give the house life again. Not because either demanded it, but because both needed it. And in that unspoken deal, Clara began to rediscover something she thought she had lost forever: the quiet, steady belief that she was worth more than survival. She was worth love. The first blossoms of spring had begun to open when Clara realized something strange had taken root inside her, something she had not dared to feel in years. It was not safety, though Samuel had given her that. It was not gratitude, though she felt it daily. It was hope. Hope is a fragile thing, like the first bud on a frostbitten branch. For Clara, it felt almost dangerous. She had lived so long preparing for disappointment that joy seemed like a trap waiting to snap shut. Yet every day she remained at the ranch, every meal Samuel shared without condition, every moment of silence where he let her simply exist, those things wove together into a thread of trust, binding her to a life she had never thought she deserved. The townsfolk noticed, too. When Samuel took Clara into town for supplies, heads turned. Some looked with curiosity, some with suspicion, and others with quiet approval. Clara kept her eyes down, embarrassed by the whispers. Who was she, after all? A woman who had once been ready to sell herself for bread. A woman patched together by shame and survival. Standing beside Samuel, respected, steady Samuel, she felt like a fraud. One evening, when they returned from the market, Clara paused at the porch, unable to hold her fear any longer. "Samuel," she said, her voice tight, "what do people say about me?" He looked at her calmly. "They say I smile more these days. They say the ranch doesn't look so empty anymore." She shook her head. That's not what I meant. You know my past. You know what I came here offering. Don't you ever feel ashamed of me?" Samuel's expression softened. He set down the sack of flour he was carrying and stepped closer. "Clara," he said gently, "do you know what I see when I look at you? I see a woman who stood at my door with nothing left and still had the courage to knock. I see a woman who works harder than anyone I've ever known. I see a woman who brings life back to a house I thought would stay silent forever. If anyone should be ashamed, it's me, for the times I've taken life for granted. But you? No, never you." Her eyes filled, her breath catching in her chest. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let those words settle into her bones. But the old scars of survival don't vanish overnight. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them deepened in ways neither spoke aloud. Samuel began teaching Clara how to ride a horse, his hand steady on hers as he showed her the reins. She began leaving books by the hearth, reading passages aloud in the evenings, her voice bringing warmth to the long nights. They worked side by side in the fields, in the kitchen, in the rhythms of daily life, until the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt whole. Yet even as their lives wove together, Clara held back. She still believed she was living on borrowed time, that one day Samuel might wake and remember she had come to him as a woman with nothing but shame to offer. But Samuel had been carrying something of his own, a quiet decision, formed slowly but surely, like a seed buried deep in winter soil, waiting for spring. It was on a Sunday afternoon when he finally acted. The air was clear, the sky painted wide and blue, and Clara was tending to the flowers she had planted near the porch. Samuel approached, his steps measured, his hand curled around something small in his pocket. "Clara," he said softly. She turned, brushing soil from her hands, smiling faintly. "Yes." He gestured toward the oak tree that stood tall at the edge of the pasture. "Walk with me." They walked in silence, the grass swaying gently around them, the breeze carrying the scent of blossoms. Beneath the oak, Samuel stopped. He took a deep breath, his usually steady face betraying a flicker of nervousness. "You came to me," he began, "offering yourself for survival. But Clara, you've given me something far greater than food or labor. You've given me laughter again. You've given me light in a house that had been dark for too long. You've given me reason." Clara swallowed hard, her heart thundering. Samuel reached into his pocket and drew out a small cloth, unfolding it carefully. Inside lay a silver ring, simple but shining, its edges worn smooth with years of love. "This ring," he said quietly, "belonged to Anna, my late wife. For a long time, I thought my life with her was the only love I would ever know. But love doesn't die. It changes, it grows, it finds new roots. I don't want you here as a guest, Clara. I don't want you here as someone paying a debt you don't owe. I want you here as my partner, my wife. Will you marry me?" The world seemed to stop. The wind stilled. The branches above held their breath. Clara's vision blurred with tears, her hands trembling as she stared at the ring. I'm not worthy," she whispered. "I came to you with nothing, less than nothing. I don't deserve." "Stop," Samuel interrupted gently. He took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "You deserve everything, more than I can give. But this I offer with all I am. Not out of pity, not out of charity, out of love." Clara's knees weakened. For so long she had been defined by desperation, by the bargains of survival. But here, under the oak tree, a man was offering her not survival, but belonging. Not a transaction, but a future. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Samuel, I'll marry you." Samuel slid the ring onto her finger, the silver catching the light. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting all this time for her. Clara pressed her hand to her heart, sobs rising from a place deeper than words. Samuel pulled her gently into his arms, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt whole. That night, when she lay in her room at the ranch, she looked at the ring again and again, as if afraid it might vanish with the morning. But it didn't. It remained, a promise, a symbol, a miracle born not of desperation, but of love. And as she drifted to sleep, Clara whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for survival, but for the man who had seen past her scars and offered her something she had never thought possible. A new life, a new name, a new beginning. The wedding was small, almost quiet, but it carried a weight far heavier than any grand celebration could. The meadow beside Samuel Hart's ranch bloomed with wildflowers that morning, swaying gently in the spring breeze. Neighbors gathered, curious and touched, some with smiles, others with tears in their eyes, as they watched the widower stand tall beside the woman who had once arrived at his door with nothing but desperation in her hands. Clara wore a simple white dress, borrowed and slightly altered, the fabric soft against her skin. She felt almost like a child playing pretend until she caught Samuel's eyes. There, in the steady warmth of his gaze, she no longer saw the woman of shame and scarcity she once believed herself to be. She saw a bride. She saw a future. When the preacher asked for vows, Samuel's voice was firm, carrying across the meadow. I promise you, Clara, not just a roof, not just bread, but a life where you are wanted, respected, and cherished. This ranch is yours as much as it is mine. My heart is yours. My days are yours. My home is yours. Clara's tears fell freely, her voice trembling as she whispered back, and I promise you, Samuel, to love with all that I am, not out of debt, not out of need, but out of choice. You gave me back my dignity. You gave me back myself. I'll spend every day I'm given making sure this home knows joy again. When they sealed their vows with a kiss, the meadow erupted in applause, children clapping, neighbors smiling, and even the wind seemed to hush for a moment, as if nature itself honored the union. After the wedding feast, simple food, laughter, and music that carried into the evening, Samuel took Clara's hand and guided her back into the house. She thought he was simply leading her home, but instead he stopped at the end of a hallway she had never noticed before. A door stood there, freshly painted, the wood gleaming. What's this? Clara asked, confused. Samuel smiled softly, reaching for the handle. It's a surprise. Something I've been working on for weeks. I wanted to give you more than a ring, Clara. I wanted to give you a place that is yours. He pushed open the door. Clara gasped. The room before her was bathed in golden light from wide windows that caught the late sun. The walls were painted a soft cream, bright and welcoming. A bed stood in the corner, covered with a quilt Samuel had secretly bought from a traveling seamstress. Shelves lined the walls, empty now, but ready for books, for treasures, for pieces of Clara's life to fill them. Curtains of gentle color swayed in the breeze, stitched with care. And in the center of the room stood a desk with fresh paper and ink, a quiet place for Clara to write, to dream, to teach again if she wished. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Her voice broke into a sob. Samuel, what have you done? I built this room for you, Samuel said simply. His eyes were tender, but firm, like a man speaking a truth carved from stone. When you came to me, you thought you had nothing. But Clara, you are everything this house needed. I wanted to give you more than survival. I wanted to give you a space that is yours, not borrowed, not begged for, not traded. Yours. Clara stepped inside, her knees trembling. She ran her fingers across the windowsill, the quilt, the smooth desk. Every detail spoke not of charity, but of thought, of care, of love. She turned back to Samuel, tears streaming freely now, unable to hold them in. No one, she whispered, no one has ever given me something that was just mine. All my life I've been asking, trading, begging, surviving. And you built me a room. Samuel crossed the threshold, took her hands in his, and kissed her forehead. I built you a home, he corrected gently. Not just a room, a place where you belong. Forever. Clara collapsed against him, her sobs no longer heavy with shame, but light with release. For the first time in her life, she was not fighting to survive. She was not bargaining, not proving, not paying a debt. She was simply home. The room became more than four walls. It became a sanctuary. Clara filled the shelves with books and journals, her handwriting flowing once more. She placed flowers by the windows, their fragrance mingling with the fresh air. Children from neighboring farms began visiting, and Clara would gather them in the room, reading them stories, teaching them letters, laughter echoing off the cream-colored walls. What once was a house of silence became alive with voices and joy. Neighbors began calling it the Room of Light. They spoke of the woman who had once arrived with nothing and now gave back more than she had ever received. They spoke of Samuel, once a man bound by grief, now smiling, his heart renewed by love. Years later, when Clara sat in her room watching the sun spill across the floorboards, she often thought of the night she had knocked on Samuel's door. She had expected rejection. She had expected to give herself away in exchange for scraps. Instead, she had been given dignity, love, and a room of her own, a place where she was no longer a wanderer, but a wife, a teacher, a woman whole again. And she realized something profound. Kindness is not about what we give in exchange for something else. True kindness gives without keeping score, without expectation, without bargain. It restores. It heals. It builds rooms of light in places that once were dark. Clara leaned against the window, her wedding ring catching the sun, her heart full. She whispered a prayer of thanks for the man who saw her not as a trade, but as a treasure, and for the life they had built together. The door she once knocked on in desperation had become the door to everything she had ever dreamed of. And in that truth lay the message she carried to every child she taught, every neighbor she welcomed, every soul who crossed her path. You are not what you've lost. You are not what you've traded. You are not the shame of your past. You are worthy of light, of love, of home. Morning came to the ranch with a chorus of roosters and the golden sweep of sunlight spilling over the hills. Clara stirred from the small bed Samuel had given her, the smell of fresh hay and earth drifting faintly through the open window. For a moment, she lay still, clutching the blanket around her shoulders, half believing the night before had been a dream. Food, warmth, shelter, those had been fantasies for too long. But the steady thrum of hooves in the distance reminded her this was real. She was here, and with reality came fear. She rose quickly, smoothing the quilt as though her survival depended on leaving no trace. She expected Samuel to come any moment to remind her of the debt she owed. The stew, the bread, the room, it had all cost something, and though he had not spoken of it yet, she knew the world too well to believe kindness came without a price. So Clara did what she had always done in places she wasn't sure she belonged. She worked. By the time Samuel entered the kitchen that morning, Clara had already fetched water from the well, scrubbed the dishes, and lit the fire for breakfast. She was bent over a bowl of eggs, her fingers trembling as she tried to keep busy. Samuel paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands, watching her with a look she couldn't read. Finally, he said, "You don't need to do all that. You're a guest here." Clara froze. A guest. The word felt foreign, almost cruel in its generosity. She set down the bowl, her throat tightening. "I can't just take, Mr. Hart. I don't know what you expect of me, but I expect nothing," he said gently, cutting her off. Clara turned, searching his face for deception. "Nothing," she echoed, almost bitter. "People don't open their homes for nothing." Samuel walked to the stove, poured himself a cup of coffee, and leaned against the counter. His movements were calm, unhurried, as though her storm of fear couldn't touch him. "You're right," he said. "People usually want something in return. But I'm not people. I'm just a man who saw someone at his door who needed help. That's all." Clara gripped the edge of the table. She wanted to believe him, but disbelief had been carved into her bones. "I'll offer myself," she whispered, "and you could have taken me up on it. Why didn't you?" Samuel looked at her then, really looked, his steady eyes meeting hers across the kitchen. "Because you're not something to be taken, Clara. You're someone, and someone like you deserves more than scraps or bargains." His words landed in her chest like a stone dropped into deep water, rippling through years of shame. She turned away quickly, blinking back tears she didn't want him to see. That day, Clara worked anyway, not because Samuel demanded it, but because she couldn't yet accept the idea of rest. She scrubbed the floors until her knees ached, mended torn linens, and chopped vegetables for supper. Samuel never stopped her, but he never asked either. And when evening came, he set 2 plates on the long wooden table and gestured for her sit. "I can't," she protested softly. "You can," he said, and his voice was firm but not harsh. "Sit down, Clara. This table's been empty too long." So she sat, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she ate at a table where no bargain hovered, no debt shadowed the food. Samuel asked about her past, not prying but listening. She told him little, ashamed of the truth, but he didn't press. He only nodded, offering quiet company instead of judgment. The wind carried a bitterness that night, the kind of chill that makes even the stars look cold. The road was nothing but dust and shadows, stretching endlessly across the prairie. Along that road, a woman walked with a slow, weary gait, clutching the thin shawl around her shoulders as if it might keep her from falling apart. Her shoes were worn so thin that her feet struck the dirt as though the earth itself wanted to remind her how far she had come. Her name was Clara, though it had been years since anyone had spoken it with tenderness. Clara had once been a woman of promise. She had taught children their letters in a little schoolhouse, her voice bright, her hands quick with chalk, her heart warmed by the laughter of tiny souls. But life is never as steady as we imagine in our youth. First came the illness that swept her parents into the grave, leaving debts she could not pay. Then came the creditors, then the whispers, then the long, hungry nights where she bartered dignity for survival. Each season stripped her of something, her work, her home, her pride, until there was almost nothing left but her body and her will to keep walking. That night, she walked toward a ranch she had only heard about in passing, a place said to belong to a man both wealthy and distant, a widower named Samuel Hart. Some said he was hard as stone, others said he was simply alone. Clara didn't know which was true, and she didn't care. She needed shelter. She needed food. She needed a place where the wind could not cut through her bones. When she finally reached the gate of the Hart Ranch, her breath was shallow, her strength nearly gone. The house loomed ahead, tall and square against the starlit sky, lantern light glowing faintly from the windows. She hesitated, her hand resting on the wooden post. This was the moment. She had nothing left to offer but herself. For years she had told herself she would never do it, that she would not sell her body, that she would not let hunger dictate what she gave. But hunger is a merciless master, and desperation is a voice louder than pride. Tonight, Clara was ready to trade the last thing she had, not for gold, not for riches, but for a bed and bread. Her knock was soft at first, then louder, trembling against the thick wood of the door. When it opened, she saw him. Samuel Hart was not what she expected. His face was lined, his hair flecked with gray, his frame tall and broad from years of work. But it was not his stature that startled her. It was his eyes. They were steady, like a river that has seen both storms and droughts. Eyes that did not flinch at the sight of her ragged dress or hollow cheeks. Clara's voice cracked. Her throat burned with thirst, and shame pressed hot against her face. "I have nowhere else to go. I can work, I can clean, I can cook. I'll do anything, even if the price is myself." Her words fell heavy between them. The night seemed to hold its breath. She braced herself for the door to slam, for laughter, for scorn, for the familiar sting of being turned away. But Samuel did none of those things. He studied her in silence for a long, heavy moment, his hand still on the doorframe. Then, with a voice low and calm, he said only 3 words that Clara never expected. "Come inside, miss." She blinked. For a moment she thought she had misheard him. But Samuel had already stepped aside, holding the door open wider, letting the warmth spill onto the porch. Clara's legs wavered beneath her. She crossed the threshold slowly, as if stepping into a dream she wasn't sure would hold. The house smelled faintly of wood smoke and bread. The fire crackled in the hearth, its glow painting the walls in amber light. Clara stood there, shivering, unsure of where to place herself, unsure of what was expected. Samuel shut the door behind her, setting the latch with a click that sounded more like safety than imprisonment. He did not reach for her. He did not ask her price. Instead, he walked to the fire, stirred the logs with the poker, and said quietly, "You look half frozen. Sit down. I'll bring you something warm." The words were so simple, yet they unraveled something in her chest. Clara sat by the fire, her fingers trembling as the heat reached her skin. Samuel returned with a bowl of stew and a piece of bread, setting it gently in front of her. She ate as though she had not eaten in days, because she hadn't. Each bite was both salvation and shame, tears sliding silently down her cheeks as she chewed. When she finished, she looked up, expecting the demand to come now, the price to be named. But Samuel was sitting in a chair across the room, watching her not with hunger or cruelty, but with something else, something harder to name. Compassion? Pity? Perhaps a man who recognized a soul too near breaking. "You don't have to give me what you think you do," Samuel said at last. His voice was steady but kind. "You're safe here. For tonight, just rest." Clara lowered her gaze, her hands tightening around the empty bowl. She wanted to believe him, but the world had taught her better. No kindness came without a debt attached. No man offered shelter without expecting a price. And yet, here she was, sitting in warmth, her belly full, while Samuel asked for nothing. That night, when Samuel showed her to a small guest room and left her with clean blankets, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, but for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of the dark. She didn't know why this man had opened his door. She didn't know if tomorrow he would change his mind. But she knew one thing for certain. She had knocked with nothing to offer, and instead of rejection, she had been met with mercy. And in the quiet of that room, Clara whispered a prayer she had almost forgotten how to speak. "Thank you." She didn't know it yet, but that knock at the rancher's door would not only change her fate, it would awaken a story of love, redemption, and the kind of kindness that rebuilds lives from ashes. Because sometimes the door we knock on in desperation becomes the door that leads us home.